Morning. This is Dr. Daria Brzezinski at WAAT 750 AM on your radio dial. We are here with Children Come First every Tuesday from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. This morning we have a distinguished visitor, Dr. James Prescott. Dr. Prescott received his degrees in Canada, New Mexico, Wisconsin. He is currently the director of the American Humanistic Association, and he's former NIH Director of Child Development. Good morning, Dr. Prescott.
Good morning.
We're going to talk to Dr. Prescott this morning about all of his work, and looking here, Jim, I've got a 15-page vita here. You've done extensive work all over the country and all over the world for the last few years on developmental neuropsychology. Can you tell us a little bit about that, please? What is developmental neuropsychology?
Well, basically it's a very small discipline within the larger field of psychology in which we study brain-behavior relationships. And the developmental neuropsychologist examines how the early life experiences affects the developing brain and then ultimately behavior. So we have a very clear focus that if we are to understand behavior, we have to understand brain structure processes that underlie that behavior. And then we have to ask the most important question of how the developing brain of an infant child is encoded and programmed for certain kinds of behaviors.
Jim, you did a 20-year, I believe, study with the National Institute of Health on violence, and we'd like to talk with you about that research. I know your work has been mentioned in books like Carl Sagan's book Cosmos as a leading neuropsychologist, and many other books and references to your work. Can you tell us a little bit about your experiments and talk a little bit about the surrogate monkey relationships and how that affects violence in our schools and with children?
Yeah, let me begin that before joining the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, I was previously with the Office of Naval Research as assistant head of the physiological psychology branch. And the NICHC was a new institute that was formed within the National Institute of Health, and I went there to develop what I called the developmental behavioral biology program, which is simply to look at the broad range of brain behavioral influences, the relationships and the effects of the early environment upon brain behavioral development. And one of the major problems that I confronted was the studies that Dr. Harry Harlow and his associates at the Wisconsin Regional Primate Center, where they had separated infant monkeys from the mothers at birth and reared them in single cages where they couldn't touch or be touched by other animals or human attendants. And these animals, as infants, became extremely depressed, withdrawn, a variety of autistic-like behaviors, hyperactivity, hyperreactivity, tactile avoidance behavior, also impaired brain perception. And then as juveniles, and they also engaged in types stimulus-seeking behaviors, toe sucking and so forth. But then as the
Jim,
older,
you're going to have to talk to, remember our level of audience is not scientists, so you're going to have to talk in a little bit of English here.
Right, okay, and I'm just trying to give a description of the behavioral pathologies that do.
So they suck their toes.
Right, and to provide the sensory stimulation that they were deprived of by being separated from the mothers, and so they engage in rocking behaviors and head-banging behaviors. And then as juveniles, they engage in self-mutilation and pathological violent behavior toward other animals.
So in other words, when they were young children, because they did not have the touching stimulation from the mother, they were devoid of that, what happened is they tried to do it in themselves, and when they became adolescents, then they were literally self-inflicting rather than self-stimulating.
That's right, and that's common to most mammals who are deprived of this kind of early sensory stimulation. And males out in Scott and McGill, where I got my degree in Canada, they raise puppies in isolation, and they also develop these stereotypical behaviors and self-mutilation that would literally tear the flesh from their do.
So literally what you're telling us is that infants separated from mothers at early ages and not receiving the touch from the mother have a propensity to be able, when they become, as they grow and as they become teenagers, to be self-destructive.
Well, that is correct, and it's not only touch; it's body movement. And that's one of the great experimental breakthroughs that were made in the experimental animal studies with the monkeys. But that study was done by Dr. William Mason and Gershon Bergson, and they reared infant monkeys again in a colony room in single cages by themselves. But in one experimental group, the surrogate mother was artificially moved, and the other surrogate mother was bolted to the floor. And let me describe the surrogate mother. It was simply a Clorox bottle wrapped with a fur rug and a pipe pan attached beneath it, and then they had a metal rod running down through the Clorox bottle, which was attached to a cam-operated device, which provided movement to the surrogate mother. So the little monkey would ride on that little, surrogate mother. And then the other group of monkeys, singly caged, they had no touch or body contact with other animals. It was bolted to the floor and didn't move. And what resulted from that was very dramatic. The isolation-reared monkey that was reared on the moving mother surrogate did not develop all these behavioral pathologies. So they grew up not being depressed, not being socially withdrawn, not being hyperactive, reactive, no pathological violence. There was some self-stimulation, but no self-mutilation. And but they were basically normal, socially inquisitive animals. And the only variable that distinguished between these two groups of animals was body movement. And that was a profound discovery, and that's what led me to consider the brain mechanisms that were involved in that particular sensory input and why it was so important. And
so the two studies were one on the touching, the infants who were able to be held and touched at early ages, and the second was body movement, like rocking. Is that correct?
Well, the earlier studies by the Harlows involved a variety of different experimental conditions, but we were able to isolate that it was the sensory deprivation of touch before Dr. Mason and Bergson did the moving surrogate study, because they were all reared with a stationary surrogate. They were not moved. That was the major change that Dr. Mason made. And lo and behold, that one variable of movement essentially prevented the behavioral pathologies, what we call the maternal social deprivation syndrome, from developing. And then re-examining that in terms of developmental processes, we can see that the primary sensory stimulation of the fetus in gestation during fetal development is movement, with the mother moving around throughout the day and so forth. And that's what led to my cross-cultural studies, which we'll get to later. But the question that came up was that no one had conducted brain studies on these isolation-reared animals, these mother-deprived animals. And that's what I initiated when I joined the NISHD with several other investigators, and lo and behold, we found indeed brain pathology.
And what did you discover was the correlation between the touching and the body movement in the brain?
Well, what we found is that the isolation-reared monkeys had brain pathology, that is, and abnormal electrophysiological activity of brain cells. They had high voltage spike discharges and deep brain structures, particularly limbic structures, but also the cerebellum. And there was structural deficits of brain cells, so that there was abnormal dendrites of brain cells. And of course, this is discovered back in the late 60s and early 70s. And then we also discovered a study initiated with Dr. Coleman. We did platelet serotonin analysis in the isolation-reared monkeys versus the normally reared.
Now, serotonin is something that we've heard in the mainstream these days. What is serotonin, and how does that affect it?
This is where a major importance really comes in here, is that the sensory deprivation, the lack of affectional bonding, results in altered neurochemistry of brain cells, as well as physiological activity activity as well as its structural characteristics. And other studies done by psychiatrists with human subjects who were attempted suicide, committed homicide, have been consistently found to have deficits of brain serotonin compared to subjects who did not show those behaviors. So deficits of brain serotonin are directly linked to depression, impulse discontrol, and pathological violence, both homicide and suicide. And now the critical importance of this in terms of the studies of mother love, what we talked about, mother love deprivation, is that it does alter this brain serotonin system so that there are brain serotonin deficits. These studies come from the animal studies, but we know because of other studies that we can expect violent. We have established that with adult subjects who are pathologically violent to have and depressed to have deficit brain serotonin. But the point that I have been trying to emphasize is that it's the failure of mother love to properly encode and develop the developing brain with brain serotonin and other neurotransmitter substances.
Here we go, blaming mothers again for all of our problems.
Well, I know that was coming through, but it's really not blaming mother. It's really blaming.
What do you mean?
It's really blaming society for its failure to support mothers being nurturing mothers.
Oh, well, that's a different story.
Well, yeah, but I just didn't have a chance to get to that point, but I'm glad you raised that point. And so there's another critical issue here, too. It's not just the sensory aspects of touch and body movement, but also the nutrients in breast milk. In breast milk, there's a wide variety of course, biochemical factors, very rich compared to infant formula milk. One critical element is tryptophan, which is the precursor amino acid for conversion into development of brain serotonin. This is absent in infant formula milk. So we are affecting brain development, specifically in terms of the brain serotonin system, by not breastfeeding. And so we are essentially producing generation after generation of children who have brain deficits, that's my prediction, of brain serotonin due to the failure of one, overall nurturance, physical affectional bonding, which includes breastfeeding. So we have two sources which contribute to the development of brain serotonin. And so it's not surprising to understand why there is so much depression in adolescence, youth, and adulthood. It's one of the most frequent dominant mental, if we call it mental disorders, in our culture today. There's something like 1.5 million prescriptions of antidepressants to children and youth in our society this past year, particularly of the what is called the serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which acts to increase the level of brain serotonin. So the question is, what are we doing wrong that all these children and youth have to have antidepressants? And that's just one drug. You know, we take a look at Ritalin, and it's another medication for children and youth. So we really need to start paying attention as to our national social policies as to supporting mothers being nurturing mothers, and that means being with their infants and children and not in institutionalized daycare. So we run up against some major social policies that at the national level are very destructive, and we're now, in my view, paying the high cost and penalty for that.
Well, let me stop you for a second and remind our audience. This is Children Come First, WAAT 750 AM on your radio dial. We're here, this is Dr. Brzezinski. We are here every Tuesday from 10 to 11 a.m. Children Come First is produced by Earth Heart Foundation, a nonprofit organization with offices in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and New Mexico. Children Come First is underwritten by CK Auto Parts Incorporated with stores in Moosic, Scranton, Pittston, and Kingston. You can visit them on our worldwide website at www.ceekayauto.com. We're here today with Dr. Jim Prescott, former director of the National Institute of Health and Children and Welfare. And Dr. Prescott is talking with us about the effects of our birthing practices and child rearing practices in America and how they affect the brain. And we were talking about tryptophan and serotonin a few minutes ago and how we have been giving children antidepressants, and what Dr. Prescott has told us is it is in fact our practices, our child rearing practices for the first 3 to 6 years of life that is creating this tremendous amount of children who are on antidepressants like tryptophan, beta blockers, etc., and a rising level of serotonin. And I wanted to, let's go back a minute. We were talking about, let's take a few steps backwards here on your information about breastfeeding. There's another byproduct of breastfeeding as well, which has to do with the immune system of children. Can you help us with a little on that?
Well, yeah, that's another major factor for children. Children's immune system doesn't fully mature until about 5-6 years of age, and breast milk is absolutely essential for the first conferring the antibiotic protection of the mother through the colostrum and the first days of breastfeeding to the infant for protection of resistance to disease and infection and the like. But it's also essential for the development of the infant's own immune system, and that takes a number of years to develop. So by not breastfeeding, particularly for the duration of time that is recommended by the World Health Organization, which is 2 years and beyond.
The UNICEF and the American Association of Pediatrics also recommends that. Is that correct?
They recommended a year, and so, but the World Health Organization, UNICEF, have been recommending 2 years of age and beyond for over 10 years now. So it's kind of surprising that the American Academy of Pediatrics would recommend only 1 year in the light of that other recommendation, and in the fact that if you take a look at primitive cultures, that breastfeeding is much beyond that 2 years. In fact, one report in Mother Magazine indicates that it's about 4.2 years or something like that.
Well, it's not surprising in light of the fact that companies that produce canned milk and bottles and pacifiers and all that would much rather we buy their products than breastfeed our children.
Well, that's absolutely right, and this has been fought for years and years and years by the World Health Organization because it contributes to early death of many infants and children in third world countries because they have no way of, one, they're deprived of the essential nutrients that breast milk is designed for, and then the infant formula milk cannot be properly maintained and prepared so that the infants do not get proper nutrition, from the infant formula milk. A common practice is for the mothers is to stretch the budget, and so they put water in with the infant formula milk, diluting it, and that furthers the nutritional deprivation of the infant and child.
Ironic enough, breastfeeding is free. Isn't it amazing?
It is, and before I forget, let me just make one mention, is that my position at the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development was director of the Developmental Behavioral Biology Program, which is one of the many programs within ICHD. So I was not director of the overall institute, but just this particular program. So I just wanted to clarify that. So anyway, back to the breastfeeding, we are really in a very critical situation, because of essentially the lack of breastfeeding in this country. And although there's something like 62% of mothers initially begin breastfeeding, that drops off to at 6 months to about 25%, and then only about 14% are breastfeeding in 1 year. So you can see.
So what you're saying is that our practices in America have led our children to be deficient nutritionally because they aren't breastfed, that they are in need of antidepressants when they get to be teenagers because they are not touched, because they aren't close to the body. So literally what you're telling us then is the daycare movement and the movement by companies, bottle making companies, the formula companies, etc., are all selling us a bill of goods. Is that correct?
Well, in a sense, that is right. And we have to distinguish about daycare, daycare of children 5 years of age and younger versus older. My concern is primarily with children 5 years of age and younger. And we have no business of institutionalizing daycare for infant children under 5 years of age, and without paying a high cost and penalty for that. And,
can you tell us what some other countries have done with daycare?
Well,
Weren't you telling me something about Sweden or Holland?
Well, their policies, I don't have the specific data yet on these countries, but they have far more liberal policies of maternal leave and also paternal leave. But I unfortunately can't give you exact specifics on the policies of these different nations. All I know is that in this country it's very, very poor. That we have actual policies of forcing the separation of mothers and infants under the new Welfare Reform Act of 1996. But if the mother is to continue to qualify for daycare, then she has to give up breastfeeding if she's breastfeeding and put her infant into institutionalized daycare and hand over the care of her infant child to stranger care. And this is emotionally devastating for infants and children. And we have yet to examine really the long-term consequences of this kind of stranger care and failure of breastfeeding compared to a group of children who are not subjected to these separation experiences and who have been breastfed for 2 years or longer. That's one of the studies that I've been trying to promote for some years now. And
do we have any research on longitudinal studies with regards to children in daycare? I haven't seen anything.
Oh, in fact, all the major, and that I can determine, national collaborative projects, longitudinal studies of 30, 40 years, none of them bothered to even record whether the mother breastfed or not, or even how long. That was considered that unimportant. And yet it's probably one of the single most important variables in early development to be examined.
How fascinating.
In addition to the extent to which there are separation experiences.
Let's talk a little bit about your research. Let's get back to your research again. We're going to just talk a little bit about it because we'll be taking a break here at the bottom of the hour. Tell us about, you also did, not only you looked at the study of monkeys with Dr. Harlow, primates in captivity, but you also studied other cultures. You studied 49 or 50 cultures, I believe, around the world.
Yeah, that one of the things that came, became very clear is that it was unquestioned that these monkeys who appeared under these kinds of sensory deprivation of separation of mother led to abnormal brain development and function. And the question is, was this really true for the human primate? And so that's what led me to an examination of the existing database that other cultural anthropologists have collected in their own studies, unknown to each other. So basically what I did was to go to the human relations area files, and at that time, this was back in the late 60s, R.B. Texter, cultural anthropologist, had compiled a huge statistical inventory of the findings from a variety of cultural anthropologists throughout the world on 400 culture samples of primitive or pre-industrial cultures. And what I was looking for is the critical variable, which was identified from the Mason-Berkshire study, that is, does the mother carry the infant on its body throughout the day? That is even more important than breastfeeding. Hard to believe that, but we have to understand that in the primitive cultures, there is no option. You either breastfeed the infant or the infant dies. And we can get to some of the later studies that I did on breastfeeding in primitive cultures, but I selected all the cultures in this 400 culture sample in which there was information available on whether the infant was carried on the body of the mother or caretaker throughout the day, and then compared it with cultures in which there was rating of no infant carrying, and that yielded 49 cultures. And it turned out, then of course the other, I should say that in addition to that, I needed a measure of violence. And so I took the most extreme measure of violence that was available in the human cultural area file. And this was my Slater on torture and killing and murdering of enemy captured in warfare. So when you combine those two variables, I was able to find 49 cultures in which I could now compare violence with the child rearing practice of carrying the infant on the body of the mother. And those 49 cultures, there was 29 who were peaceful and 20 that were violent.
All right.
And it turned out that this one variable alone was so powerful that it could predict the violent and peaceful nature of 80% of the cultures.
We'll be coming back with this, continue with this conversation with Dr. Jim Prescott, who is the former Director of Behavioral Development Research at the National Institute of Health. You are listening to Children Come First, WAAT 750 AM on your radio dial. We are here every Tuesday from 10 to 11 a.m. This is Dr. Daria Brzezinski. We are talking about children and violence and how our child rearing practices in the United States have led to the kinds of violent behaviors you see at Columbine and the other shootings among our children. How the fact that we separate our children both at birth and through our daycare practices and keep them isolated, how it affects our children with regard to their brain, the serotonin level, the tryptophan level, and how this leads to depression and the need for antidepressants of our children in the teenage years. We've been talking about breastfeeding and its importance, not merely just for the sake of bonding, but also the effects it has for children on their immune system and how important it is with regard to the children feeling safe in the nurturing environment. So there are many issues here that we are talking about. Dr. Prescott did a 20-year study on violence through the National Institute of Health, and we are going to be continuing talking with that on our broadcast through the rest of the next half hour. You can call us at 570-639-2931 if you would like additional information about our speaker today. Again, the number is 570-639-2931, or you can email us at prokids, PROKIDS, at rlc.net, and we will be giving you the information about Dr. Prescott on our next half hour. Please come back and join us after our break and we hear from our sponsors.
Cultures that were misclassified from the earlier child rearing practice variable, that I could correctly classify the peaceful, violent nature of the 49 cultures with 100% accuracy by incorporating the issue of whether adolescent sexuality is punished or permitted. So basically, the conclusion is that if a culture is highly nurturing and affectionate, both in a mother-infant and child relationship and in adolescent sexual or love relationships, you have a peaceful culture. And if you deny physical affection and pleasure and nurture in the mother-infant relationship, that is, you have the unblended child, and then repressive sexuality in adolescence, you will have a violent culture. So
I could go off on some of these tangents and get in a real bomb here, but I don't choose not to do that. Let's talk about how these cultures showed, the peaceful cultures nurtured their children. In what way did that manifest?
Well, it's basically whether they...
Everybody has a different definition of nurture.
Well, we have to distinguish what was the criteria for the experiment versus the broader characteristic of nurturance, because that single variable of carrying the infant in the body is highly correlated with a variety of other measures of nurturance, such as if you don't punish your infant, that there's a very significant reciprocal relationship between whether or not you're highly nurturant toward your infants and children, respond immediately to the needs and discomfort, as opposed to inflicting punishment and pain. So that the cultures that are nurturing and affectionate tend not to use pain and punishment as a form of quote, discipline.
I was amazed to read one of the cultures, and I can't remember which one, it'll lose me, as an African culture. The mothers and the children were so in tune and in sync with each other that the mother literally carried the child around all day long in a sack against her body, and literally could feel when that child was about to defecate, and remove the child from the sack and hold it out, and it did its business and brought it back in again. I was just totally amazed at how in touch with their children and how they communicate in such nonverbal ways. It was astounding.
Well, it's in a way not surprising when you examine what the infant and child has just spent its first 9 months inside the body of a mother. You know, and you have this intimate body contact. It's not only contact, but it's a part of the mother's body. And so at birth, there is a separation, and the most critical thing is really to maintain that body contact continuity, so that infant does not feel that it's been abandoned by being separated from the mother and placed in a crib that doesn't move. It's really that movement that really is the bridge that maintains continuous contact and assurance with the infant, long before it can see or speak or understand language, that there is a love relationship there. And that's one of the things that we really need to emphasize, that infants know whether loved or not loved before they can even recognize their mother or father visually or auditorily, before they can understand language. So the language of love is really quite special, although it follows the same rules as the acquisition of the language of speech. And this is another important point to emphasize, that any newborn can learn any language in the world and speak it like a native, provided its developing brain is exposed to the sounds of that language during the formative periods of brain development for language acquisition. And just as that is true for speech, it's also true for language of love. And so once that period is gone, it's very difficult to learn the language of love and express it later in life. And
now, were these countries that you studied modern countries?
No, these are primitive cultures, pre-industrial cultures.
That are here today? Exist today?
Well, I don't know how many are still existent today, but most of them probably are. But
what are the lessons that we can now learn from these cultures?
Well, basically, we learned that we really need to carry our infants on the body of the mother throughout the day, like these primitive cultures did. We need to adopt the practice of breastfeeding, and at least consistent with the recommendation of the World Health Organization of 2 years or longer, and not to be used as corporal punishment and physical punishment of children, as a form of discipline. So that, and this is most crucial and most relevant to our current situation here in the United States. In fact, we got 2 states that just recently passed laws making it lawful for parents to physically, spank their children. One is Oklahoma, and now it's waiting for the signature of the government. And so these senators, they voted. I got the vote here up on the screen. That's 96-4.
What was the other state?
Let's see. The other state was
That's all right.
oh no, it's Oklahoma and
What are these?
Nevada.
Nevada.
These two states have just passed laws to permit violence against children in terms of spanking. You know, and so in the wake of what has happened in Columbus, you know, it's just the wrong reaction and the wrong.
You mean Colorado?
I mean Colorado, and but also, yeah, I was thinking of something else. Yeah. And then we also have the situation in Georgia. So,
well, what I've done is I've done a little bit of research on the shooters in many of these instances, and ironically enough, Ed Harris from Colorado happened to be on Zoloft, which is an antidepressant, and many of the other shooters were all on antidepressants.
well, that is true, and in fact, in a recent report on Time Magazine, when they reviewed, I think, something like 9 of these killers across a number of different states.
Yeah, I know. I sent it to Time Magazine.
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, okay. They all of them have major emotional problems. They're all depressed. Many of them, most of them, were on the antidepressants, and so we have that history that really needs to be fully developed. You know, across the board. You know, and start examining just. You know, how many of our depressed adolescents, and how many of them are full of anger and rage and hostility, which is ready to blow up in violence. And that question is not being really addressed. They talk about gun control, but all the gun control in the world isn't going to control or impact at all on the depression and on the anger and the rage and hostility that these adolescents have.
Besides,
So my criticism is not that the gun control is not necessary, but it distracts our society from really addressing the true causes of this violence and this depression.
how can we help our children? I mean, you're talking about doing something to change the practices of birthing here, prenatal, postnatal, but we really aren't addressing, you really haven't said what we can do, or can we do anything with regard to our children who are not birthed in this way? What kinds of things can we do? Do we keep giving them antidepressants?
Well, we have both a short-term and a long-term solution. And I think mothers, it's just not mothers, but society at large now has to evaluate, you know, how we do business. I mean, there was one time in this country that the income of one adult was sufficient to raise a family of 4. That's no longer the case. That's forcing mothers into the workplace at less than livable wages, and it's just compounding the situation and making it worse. And we need to stop and reassess what we're doing and supporting mothers to be nurturing mothers in the home. And I've yet to see a full cost accounting of this Child Welfare Reform Act. Millions and millions of dollars are given to the states to provide training, you know, for the welfare mothers, for example. And a lot of it's remain idle. And it seems so much better sense to use this money to support mothers at home, be nurturing mothers, or bring them into parent-child development centers, where there's no separation of the mother from the infant and child, and where they get training into proper parenting skills, as opposed to the institutionalized daycare situation. So we do have a major problem, and it's not going to be easy to correct. And it's getting worse under the Welfare Reform Act, because then these mothers, after 2 years, they're stripped of all support. And there's no support network left for them.
If there was one thing that you could do to reduce violence, what would it be?
Well, it would support mothers being nurturing mothers, you know, and to support them, you know, and breastfeeding for 2 years of age and beyond, and also people carrying their infants. We should provide these little body carriers, so that the infant is carried continuously in the body of the mother throughout the day. That is what the scientific data supports. And this was a common child-rearing practice in Japan, China, and many other countries until they became modernized, and also Africa. So
I was going to ask you now to go back a little, take a few steps backwards, and we've constructed deep and powerful defense structures that distort our perception, and these barriers are built into the nervous system. How can we disarm ourselves with from these barriers to cope
I'm
with?
not sure exactly what your question is.
In order to protect our emotional sexual core, you were talking about the adolescent sexualities and predicting peace.
Well, basically, we're also teaching the wrong message with respect to sexuality. That it's sinful, it's dirty, it's immoral. Rather, we ought to be saying that sexuality is just too important, to be left hostage to the marriage state, and the marriage state is too important to be left hostage to the sexual state. But basically, we need to be teaching the overriding importance of relationships, and that's where sexuality has its greatest meaning and greatest satisfaction. So that
well, there's so many taboos on sexuality. It's hard to differentiate between the myth and the reality.
Well, that's one of our major problems. So you combine a sexually puritanical ethic with one that supports the use of punitive methods of child rearing and the deprivation of physical affection and pleasure. It wreaks havoc with the developing brain, nervous system, and obviously the behavior of the child, the adolescent, and the adult. And we do have to remember that every adult was at one time a teenager and was one time a child and an infant. And so we're just, we have to keep that developmental perspective. And I would like to point out, that with all this concern about youth violence, that in fact the adult violence is much greater than the youth violence. And
what do you mean?
Well, it's just that this has to do with debatable data, and it was been summarized by Mike Malice in The Escapable Generation, a book called America's War on Adolescence, and published in 1996. And he's simply documented, and others have, that in fact we are being misinformed that there is an epidemic of teenage violence when there isn't. The adult violence is much greater. Let me report. This came out through reported by the Christian Science Monitor when they point out some of the findings of analysis in the book. And he says that 3/4 of babies born to teenagers are fathered by adult men. That 90% of the children under age 12 and 60% of the teens ages 12 to 17 who are killed in this country are killed by adults. And nobody rails against the widespread grown-up pathology. So when one looks at these kinds of statistics, our problem is with adults.
I think
they're the ones that create the problems in our infants and children and youth.
You're listening to Children Come First. This is WAAT 750 AM on your dial. This is Dr. Brzezinski, and we have been here for the last 45 minutes or so speaking with Dr. Jim Prescott, former Director of Behavioral Development Research at the National Institute of Health, and we're talking about violence in our children and our practices in America on the birthing of our children and the caring of rearing of our children and how it leads to violence among our children. The devastating consequences. I've heard you speak in the past before about allowing women the ability to be able to control their own bodies. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Well, this is the central to all of this. When one looks at beyond the child rearing practices and sexual practices, this obviously is defined by the philosophical and moral assumptions that a culture makes, and so and that means the role of a woman and her sexuality, and that's why there is such gender inequality throughout the world, and it's a consequence, in my view, of the patriarchal theistic cultures, which continually probe and dominate essentially a woman, her body, and certainly the expression of her sexuality. So I'm, fully supportive of gender equality legislation that would truly give equality to women with men. And
that's not going to happen since we have so many legislators who are males and so few who are females, and basically the male population has dominated our culture and our value system and our rules and everything else that happens in our society. How can we possibly change that mentality?
Well, we can, but this is a drum that I've been beating for a number of years, and nobody wants to listen to me also. And that is a proposal that 50% of the Senate and the House of Representatives and the state legislators be men and women. And the Senate, that's very easy. There's 2 senators from each state, so 1 senator is a male, 1 senator is a female. And everyone votes, obviously, for both of the candidates. In the House, it's a little bit more difficult, but the easiest solution is just to double the number of representatives in the House of Representatives, so you have a male and female representing each district, so you don't have to do any redistricting. And this would make a profound change in our nation, in our national laws, where 50% of the elected representatives are male, 50% are female. And I just simply want to emphasize that the 19th Amendment, the equal right to vote, does not translate into equal right of representation. And so that is the unfinished agenda, and I'm hoping that there will be some party that will come forward and make that initiative. That's one of the objectives that can be pursued at the national political level to bring about gender equality representation. But that's not going to immediately impact upon some of these more fundamental issues of what is moral and what is immoral. We have this whole philosophical and theistic worldview that pleasure and sexual pleasure is sinful and immoral, and at its very core. And that sexuality can only be legitimized within a marriage state, and that's just plain wrong. I mean, the human person, engaged in sexual relationships extremely more often than just was required to produce a child or two, which is the average size of our family.
Now let's get to reality and nitty-gritties here. You said that basically the possible lesson for our culture is that these breakdowns in effectual bonding reflect in everything from our divorce rate to crimes to alcoholism, drug abuse, etc. And you're asking us for mothers to stay home with their children, or at least be close to their children, and daycare perhaps is not the answer. In our modern society today, where 2 parents have to work in order to keep up with the Joneses, what would be the suggestion to those mothers who feel they must work? And actually, your perception of mothers is accurate. Being a woman and having been a single mother, I can tell you that a woman who stays home with her children is not regarded very highly, especially at parties where when someone asks you what you do and you say, I'm a mother who stays home. I mean, that's not something that anybody wants to talk about. How can we elevate the status of a woman, number one, to be any parent who stays home and raises their children? How can we do something to elevate that status, and or what can we do to mothers who do go to work, and how can we help them?
Well, that's a complex question with even more complex answers or attempted solutions. I think you well described just how impossible our culture is to raise any infant child with affection and nurture and bonding. we have very few bonded children, and that means very few bonded adolescents and bonded adults. And that impacts, let me follow this train of thought, that impacts on the stability of the male-female relationship as an adult. Because when that infant does not bond with its mother, it's certainly not going to bond with anyone else. And that's certainly true in the daycare, which is run by strangers. There's a high turnover rate. It's impossible for the infant child to bond with anyone in the daycare center. They don't bond with the mother, and usually hasn't really bonded with the father, although there's some changes in terms of recognition of the importance of the father in bonding. And so you have essentially an unbonded child. And then we wonder why these kids grow up to be depressed and seeking drugs for self-medication for their emotional pain of loss of human love. You know, and that's you know, our history. And then we come back with the punitive laws that criminalize drug use, which is an attempt to deal with a history of loss of human love, rather than dealing with the specifics of crime that's associated with drug use and punishing the crimes and not the drug use itself. And we learned that with alcohol. You know, the prohibition of alcohol did not work, and we made criminals out of people who just consumed alcohol. And we haven't learned from that history. So we need a drastic revolution, really, in how we're dealing with the drug use and consumption in this country, the recognition of what drives this, and also that this massive consumerism is another reflection of this loss of human love, because we try to fill the void with material objects, and you never can. And so there's a compulsion of this chronic stimulus-seeking behavior again, which is likely to manifest in consumption behavior. But it's really not getting to the emotional core of relationship, and that's what we really have to emphasize, you know, throughout human development, beginning with the mother, the father, the school system, the community, and as adolescents develop sexual relationships, it's to emphasize the absolute necessity of relationship, you know, and that will put a major break on casual sex and irresponsible sex. So there are things that we need to do, but our national policy really is almost at all levels geared against this. And
well, I thank you for everything you've given us today. You certainly have given us a lot of food for thought. This has been Dr. Jim Prescott. You can reach him email-wise at dprescol@san.rr.com. That's Dr. Jim Prescott at dprescol@san.rr.com, where you can find out about his website.
One correction, that L is a 1.
I'm sorry, no wonder I can't ever reach it.
Prescol 1, and
dprescol1 at san.rr.com. Sorry about that. He has a website, www.violence.de, and you can reach us here if you'd like any information about Dr. Prescott or anyone else who's been on our program. We are 570-639-2931. Our email is prokids, PROKIDS, @rlc.net. That number again is 570-639-2931. Our number and web email is prokids, PROKIDS, @rlc.net. This is Children Come First, and this is Dr. Daria Brzezinski. Dr. Prescott, thank you so much for having been a guest today and for giving up your time of day today to be with us out there in California.
Well, I appreciate very much you having me, and I hope this information will prove helpful to your listeners, and I want to thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and please join us again next week on 7:50 a.m. Children Come First, WAAT AM 7:50 a.m. on your radio dial. We'll be back with you next Tuesday from 10 to 11 a.m. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day, and hug those children.